Hello and welcome. My name is Zachary Graulich, and I'm the Assistant Director of Education, and it's a pleasure to be joined today by Evelyn Altenberg, who is one of our second-generation Holocaust survivors here. So I really appreciate you being here today, Evie, for another episode of Legacy Chronicles. So first, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Zach, for having me here.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So you've been involved here at HMTC for quite some time, but before we get into that, I would love to hear a little bit about your parents and kind of what their survival stories were.
Okay. Well, they were both Holocaust survivors, but in very different ways, with very different stories. But I'll just start by telling you that they were both born in Berlin, Germany, where they had normal childhoods and met when they were teenagers. And as my mother used to say, it was love at first sight for him, but she needed a bit more persuading. But very quickly they fell in love and, in fact, were devoted to each other for the rest of their lives. About a year after they met, my mother's family, her parents and she was an only child, they moved the family to the Netherlands, Holland, because they wanted to get out of Germany due to the rising anti-Semitism. My mother had been forced to leave her school. And so they moved to Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And throughout this time, my parents wrote to each other every day. A little while later, my father's younger sister also moved to the Netherlands. And a year or two after that, my father did as well. And here's where their paths started to diverge somewhat. Because when my father got to the Netherlands, he got a job on a ship that was a cargo ship, and it delivered cargo all over the world, really, Europe, Africa, and it happened to be in the United States in 1940 when the Nazis invaded Holland. His ship could not go back, and I'll just tell you a little bit about him and then switch to my mother. And the United States would only let him stay here for 60 days. He had a sailor's visa. So he went from one Jewish organization to another, hoping that someone would help him find a place to go to. And at one organization, they asked him if he'd like to go to the Dominican Republic. And it's a little known story that the otherwise very brutal dictator of the Dominican Republic had agreed to take in up to 100,000 Jews, unlike most countries at the time. And so my father just said, would he be able to try to get his loved ones out of Europe, his mother, his sister, his fiancée, who was my mother, they had gotten engaged, and her parents, could he try to get them out? And he was told yes. And so he went by ship to the Dominican Republic and spent the war years there. My mother and her parents, and he was able to the only one he was able to get out was his mother, which he didn't expect to. She was older, but at one point she was able to leave. However, the Nazis really closed the doors of Europe and did not allow people to leave. So my mother and my father's sister and my mother's parents were all trapped in Holland, which was now occupied by Germany. A very brutal occupation for the Jews in particular. And one day there was a knock on the door, and the Nazis came and they picked up my mother and her parents and sent them to a concentration camp in Holland. From there, her parents were taken to other concentration camps, ending up in Auschwitz, where they were murdered. My father's sister, who had just gotten married, she and her husband were also picked up by the Nazis, taken to Auschwitz, and murdered. And many other relatives of my mother, including her 4-year-old little cousin, Renata. I like to say her name just so somebody remembers her. She and her parents were killed in Sobibor concentration camp, also taken from Holland. My mother begged to be allowed to go with her parents, but they were transported without her, and as I say, ended up in Auschwitz. My mother spent 3 years in 9 concentration camps. She also was sent to Auschwitz, where she was tattooed with a number on her arm. And she was she was, they would send people to one side or the other. The left, one side was the gas chamber, one side was slave labor. My mother was sent to the slave labor site. And for 3 years was transported to various camps. She worked in a salt mine. She worked in a munitions factory. And she was on a death march where she described people just falling and being left where they fell. They were starved, they were beaten, they were shot. And she says that it helped her that one of her friends and she were there together, and one of her friends from the camps, and they helped each other. And at the end of the war, my mother was liberated. She got in touch with my father, who had no idea if she was alive. Wow. And she didn't know if he had married someone else. Yeah. And when she joined him in the Dominican Republic, they had been separated for 6 years. Yeah. When my mother was liberated, she weighed 57 pounds. And she started off as part of a group of 1,500 women, and 80 survived. So I think that's less than 5%. And then my parents got married in the Dominican Republic. A little while later, came to the United States and had me and my brother.
Wow.
So that's their story. And they were devoted to each other for the rest of their lives.
Two incredible, remarkable stories. And so I have to ask, growing up, did you always know that they were both survivors, or do you remember a time when you found out?
Yeah, I always knew. I don't remember a moment where they sat down and told me. I don't know how they did it. And interestingly enough, I recently asked my children, do you remember when we told you? And they said no, they didn't either. So I don't know. I also, first of all, my mother had a number on her arm.
Of course.
It wasn't like a secret what she went through. Second of all, my mother didn't talk much about her experiences growing up, although she always said to me, you can ask any questions you want. Mm-hmm. But I didn't want to ask questions. I felt it. And but my father was a storyteller and would tell me happy things from his childhood, but he also, along the way, I think it must have been from his stories that I learned while I was growing up. And also, I grew up in a community of survivors. I grew up in Washington Heights in Manhattan, which had a large German-Jewish refugee community, German and Austrian Jews. And so everybody's parents had an accent. I'm exaggerating, but that's how it felt. It was very normal. And everyone had a story.
Wow. So, you grew up surrounded by all of this. Did you ever foresee yourself at some point in your life basically carrying the torch for them and speaking on behalf of them when they were no longer here? Was that something that you ever imagined, or just kind of came about later down the line?
It came about later down the line. I never thought about it. As I said, it was just there. I've had I felt loving and warm and happy childhood, except that I was extremely shy, but never mind about that. That had nothing to do with them. And I wasn't even thinking about it. And I guess because it was so taken for granted in the community where I lived. But later, when I retired, by then I was, of course, thinking about it more. And my mother was no longer around, and my father, to tell their story. So I guess at that point I felt I should carry the torch.
Did they speak publicly at all outside of the home, to whether it be student groups or adult groups? Did they ever share their experiences with others?
My mother, it's interesting because when I was growing up, my father didn't consider himself a survivor because he had not been in the camps.
Right.
He had not been in a ghetto. He had not been a slave laborer. But of course, he was extremely impacted and lost his sister and other people. But my mother spoke through her local Jewish community center. She spoke to middle school and high school students later in life. Yeah. It was very, very difficult for her. And as I said, when I was growing up, She really didn't talk much about it, little things, but not any like real conversation about it. But later in life, she decided to speak publicly. She felt it was important.
Yeah. And now you have been involved here at the museum for quite some time, where you speak here to student groups, you go out to schools and speak as well. So tell me a little bit about how that all came to be and what that process was like for you.
Well, as I said, when I retired, I felt that I had the time, and I saw the need more at that time than when I was growing up, which was right after the war, when it was more real to everyone and certainly real to my community. And so I came here to the Holocaust Museum and Tolerance Center and said, is there something I can do? And they said, would you like to be a speaker to tell your parents' story? And so that's primarily what I do.
And I'm sure that must have been quite the process of really diving deep into the history. I mean, of course, you knew so much just from hearing about it, but obviously there's research that has to be done in terms of figuring out exact dates and the timeline and what happened. So I'm sure that was a lot of effort on your part, and I mean, it could not have been easy to really dive deep into what they both experienced.
Well, I don't know if lucky is the right word, but my mother had done a video interview with the Jewish Community Center where she was, through which she spoke, where they interviewed her. So I had that. And I also had letters, in particular, one letter. My mother had some surviving relatives in South America, excuse me, who had been asking her, what happened to your parents? What happened to you? And it took her a year to write this letter.
Wow.
And finally she did. It's a very long letter. And it starts with, today I think I can bring myself to tell you about my parents and my experiences, because as you know, today would have been my mother's birthday. And when I began to translate that letter, like, I was a mess. That first line, I was just a mess. But between the letter and her video and things I'd heard and other documents that we have, there was information.
Yeah, so you were able to really take what you had and put it together, whereas for
Exactly.
some second gen, they don't really have much of anything, especially if their
don't.
parents didn't speak about it. They have to kind of put little bits and pieces together and
Exactly.
form some semblance of a story. So as you said, maybe lucky in a way that you had that.
Right.
So tell me, I guess, for your family, whether it be your immediate family, extended family, what do they think of you kind of carrying the torch for your parents? What is their opinion on that?
They are extremely supportive. Sorry, some of my parents' granddaughters. Well, they all know the story in detail. They all have an interest in passing it forward and carrying the torch, and some of them have spoken publicly as well. So I'm confident that I can pass the torch to them.
Yeah, which is part of the struggle.
I'm already doing it. Yeah.
Which is amazing, because when it comes to Holocaust education, I feel that we are, as a community, always considering the future and making sure the lessons continue. And so you have
Exactly.
survivors who don't have children who speak, and you have 2Gs who speak, but there's no 3Gs that speak. So
Right.
it's kind of this constant thought of,
Right.
is the next generation going to do that? So it's amazing that you say there are those 3Gs in your family
Yes.
that know are going to do this and have already started, as you
Exactly.
said, which I'm sure for them has been a transformative experience.
I mean, I think we all understand how important it is
Yeah.
and how meaningful it is.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit, when it comes to Holocaust education, have you, again, we talked about it a little bit when it comes to you being involved here as a speaker, but has Holocaust education always been something that you felt passionately about, whether it be in the home with your kids, or, when your kids started going to school, was that something that they would come home and say, oh, we talked about this in school today, we learned about this, we watched this movie on the Holocaust? Just tell me a little bit about the relationship that you and your family have to Holocaust education.
I actually, well, I guess my children did get Holocaust education in school, and I remember at their high school there was a course that they both took on the Holocaust, so it was important to all of us. But I think what was most important was knowing my parents, knowing my mother, seeing the photos,
Yeah.
and just knowing this was real. And and also, I think a part that's really important is my parents were, as I said, it was a very loving, warm home and full of joy, full of music, full of my father telling jokes and my mother singing and my mother trying to really seize the day. And I think that's important also
Absolutely.
for people to know you can go through the most horror there is, and everyone comes out in different ways. But my mother, I think, came out and made a decision to try to make every moment count because you
Yeah.
don't know what's coming tomorrow. And at the same time, when I look back, I have an awareness of the missing people in our lives because they were talked about and they were, important.
Yeah. And that's such a critical part of the story. When you talk about Holocaust education and survivor experiences, I feel that just because of time constraints, both in and out of the classroom, you don't often get to speak about life after and what took
Yes.
place. And so
Yes.
what you just described is resistance in its purest form because
Yes.
they, despite what they went through, they made sure that they built lives for themselves, this family, multiple generations, and they didn't
Right.
let their experiences kind of capture them and lock them up in that 1940s time period, which unfortunately it did happen for many
And
survivors.
very understandable as
course.
well.
Yeah.
It's different for every family and every
Yeah.
survivor.
So now that you've been, again, involved in this for quite some time and giving testimony to student and adult groups, I'd love to know if there is one particular experience that you can think of, or maybe it's a question or a comment that you once got from someone who was listening that stands out to you for some reason that really, touched you or surprised you in some way.
Okay. Well, I can think of a couple of things.
Yeah.
One was just, it meant a lot to me that at some point I gave a video presentation to a room full of teachers in Western Canada.
Okay.
And I thought, wow, if each of those teachers now goes out and tells something to their students, that makes a difference. So that meant a lot to me. And I remember another sort of more individual thing I remember is this one lovely young girl coming up to me after my talk at a school and saying, she asked me a number of questions. She was really interested. And then she said, do you think it can happen again here? And I said to her, what do you think? And she said, she looked very sad, and she just touched me that she cared and she
Yeah.
was thinking, and she was relating it to the world, not, and if I can just add one quick little thing, and the other thing that really touched me is my mother got letters from classes she spoke to, and one girl I remember wrote in there to my mother after she spoke. She said, I came home and talked about your talk, and my father said it didn't happen, but I saw your face, and I know it did. So I've never forgotten that.
That's extremely powerful. And that's why testimony is so critical, because you can go through an entire museum tour, you can look at pictures and
Right.
artifacts, you can, do everything that you can, but until you add that humanity, that personal human touch and experience, it's a lot easier for people to say, well, these photos they're fake, they're taken out of context. Some
Right.
people even go as far to say these are staged actors in these photographs. We know what they say. And until you hear from either a survivor or a child of a survivor or a grandchild of a survivor,
Yes.
there is that room to basically doubt a little bit. And I think that's just human nature, because you're looking back on a history that seems so foreign, seems so
Right.
unbelievable,
Right.
that your brain, I think, and your heart doesn't want to even think this could have happened.
Right. I think that's true. I think it's hard to take in. This is so horrible. How could it have happened? And so by telling our parents' stories, we hope we're making it real and connecting to people.
Yeah. And the moments that you mentioned where you have those standout moments, again, whether it be a comment or a question from a teacher or a student, I have to imagine that's, extremely fulfilling and gratifying for you and makes everything that you do and really bearing your soul in this way that cannot be easy for you worth it.
It's so worth it. It's so worth it. Can I add one more story
Of
that just came
course.
to my mind? I spoke to a big auditorium of high school students a few years ago, and one of the questions from the students at the end was, "How old was your mother when she passed away?" And I said 90, and the whole auditorium burst into applause. They were so happy to hear that she had lived to 90, and that was a moment that just made me feel like she was real to them.
Yes. Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. You took someone who's physically no longer here, but you
Right.
you made it real for them, and you
Yes.
really brought her to them in a way that
Yes.
they felt so touched that she lived a
Yes.
long, fulfilling life that they
Yes.
just had no other choice but to applaud that.
Spontaneously applaud. Yes.
And that alone speaks to the power of second gen, third gen, fourth gen testimony,
Absolutely.
because that's what you're trying to do, is to bring the people who are potentially no longer here out into the open for pure people to learn from.
Exactly.
And
And that's what they would want too,
exactly.
without a doubt.
Exactly. And I'm sure it goes without saying that both of your parents, if they, saw you doing this, because correct me if I'm mistaken, you started this after they were both gone.
Correct.
So I have to imagine that if they were here today, seeing that you're carrying this forward, they would be so immensely proud and touched that you're doing this.
I'm sure they would be. And I think most important to them would be that it's not forgotten so that it doesn't happen to anybody else. That's how my mother always ended her talks. And that's really the mission, right?
Absolutely. So as we wrap up here, I would love to give you an opportunity to say some sort of message that you would love for anyone listening, whether it be the next generation or any one of our generation, just listening, and, some words of wisdom or a message that you would love to impart to someone who might be listening to this right now.
Ooh, that's a tough one. Okay. I guess I would want them to know that this was real, that if they have any doubts that it was real, the Holocaust, it's easy to find lots of information and they should pursue it, for example, in a place like our museum. That it was real, that it happened to ordinary, real people who did not expect this to happen, and that we have to be on our guard that it doesn't happen to anyone.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Evie, for the work that you do here. Of course, it goes without saying that it's all voluntary. This is stuff that you are choosing to do. This is work that you feel a moral and ethical obligation to do. And that alone, we have to be grateful for you and every other 2GN survivor who speaks here at the museum on a regular basis. We know how challenging it is, and it takes a lot out of you to do this work.
And I want to say that none of that would matter if I didn't have a place to do it. So I'm very appreciative of everything that the Holocaust Center here does and for doing this very important work.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And thank you for being here today, for having this conversation. It's wonderful that we have a place where you can give testimony to students, but it's also amazing that we now have this studio where we can reach people from all across the country or all across the world. So thank you so much for taking the time, for being here today and having the conversation with me.
Thank you very much.
And for anyone else who is listening, thank you so much. If you're looking for more information on HMTC or other podcasts that we've recorded, please go to hmtcli.org.